So now let's talk a little bit about how you can construct a world. We'll give you some practical examples for how you can write your world building section or your setting section in your GDD. So here are some steps for creating a world or some ideas that we're going to go through. So you can put these subheadings in your GDD. We're going to look at scope and shape. We'll look at backstory, culture and order, map, and objects and lore. And if you want to, you can also check out the link below. It's a blog post about creating a video game world by E.M. Welsh. So firstly, scope and shape. These are the sort of initial questions that you're going to have to answer about your game. And given that a lot of you have already given me a summary, either in your genre or in the first presentation that you did, of what you expect the game world or the game narrative to be, you should be able to start to answer these questions. So how big is your world? How much can the player explore? Like, does your game take place in a room, a town, a continent, the universe? There's a really different, feeling to a game like Resident Evil 2, which takes place in the town of Raccoon City, versus No Man's Sky, which takes place across like every star system that could possibly be thought of, right? These are going to create two different types of experiences, but they're both valid. So tell me what the scope and shape of your world is. So can interiors be accessed as well as exteriors? Like, are you going to be going in rooms as well as traversing outside of them? Is it going to be kind of like dreamy? Like, will the geography connect in ways that actually semi make sense, or is it going to be a little more ethereal? So is it open world? Can players feel free to explore the world in any order, or is it linear, in which case players must experience one location at a time? Knowing the structure of your narrative at this point will help you to start to structure the like actual place, like the actual setting and the shape of the levels, or however you want to describe like the game places that you'll be accessing. So the answer to this likely relates very strongly to your narrative structure. And how would you organize the play spaces in your game? Is it experienced as an open environment, in discrete levels, in an arena, etc.? So linear spaces can only be accessed one at a time, sometimes with no backtracking. So games like Monopoly, Guitar Hero, FF13, and Night in the Woods are a linear structure. You go from place to place in a structure that is set up by the author or the designer of the game. Grid-based spaces are divided up and very heavy on player interaction and movement. So Fire Emblem, Chess, Civilization are all grid-based games, and they tend to be like turn-based as well. Web spaces have points in that are interconnected with pathways for traversal. So this is also related to that non-linear story structure. So a lot of open world games and MMOs more or less function as a web of spaces that are connected, usually with like a loading screen or something in between, although sometimes there are no loading screens. Like Breath of the Wild doesn't really have that unless you're going to an interior space like a shrine. So there are usually in a web structure like landmarks or points of interest that are separated by space and sometimes traversable by teleportation. So No Man's Sky, Fallout, World of Warcraft, and Horizon Zero Dawn all use this structure. And then of course you can sort of make a combination of these. You can combine them in different parts of the game or create new ones. This is merely a starting point for you to sort of begin to pick and choose and think about it. So backstory. You should develop some kind of, at least like a couple sentences, backstory for your world so that the world feels immersive and cohesive to the player. This background will influence all of your storytelling and your experiential aspects of the game, even if this backstory is never overtly told to the player. But it might actually end up being a really big part of it, right? Like if you look at the plot of Horizon Zero Dawn, the backstory as to how everybody in Horizon Zero Dawn got to where they are it's a huge plot point, and I'm not going to spoil it for you if you haven't played it, but B, it's once you know what it is, you begin to see the evidence of it everywhere, and you begin to see the world in a different way, knowing like how it came to be that way, right? So the backstory can be very powerful. You don't have to overdevelop the setting, but adding more detail in places the player is going to come into direct contact with is usually a good idea, because then they're going to feel like a little more immersed in those situations. When I was an illustration student, we were always taught that the best like illustrations for communication would have a high amount of detail in the middle, in the place that you were supposed to be looking. It's the place that you wanted to like draw your viewer's eye, and outside of that, things would kind of fade out and not be as important to look at, right? And that would just like draw you right into the key point, the thing that you were supposed to look at. This was surgical illustration that I was doing, so it was usually like, you know, some kind of process or complex anatomy. And I feel like, you know, setting and backstory is kind of the same way. There are going to be places where you want to focus the player in, you want them to look, you want them to like really feel like that part is like super detailed. But as you get outside of those like key like focus points, you can get a little more vague, and it's fine. Your brain like basically makes sense of it. It doesn't really notice. And in fact, it would be like probably more information than you could take in if everything had like an even amount of detail, right? So how does the backdrop of your world influence decorations, buildings, fashion, soundscapes, or the characters that players meet? I DM'd a friend of mine, Doc Burford, who made Paratopic and is now making another very excellent like atmospheric narrative game. So I was asking him his advice on developing setting, and he said to me, world building should happen after you figure out your plot, and it should exist largely as spice. You shouldn't eat an entire fistful of cinnamon, but it's very nice to have a little sprinkling of it on top of the main dish. So stated another way, your world backstory could affect these parts of your design and more. Your environmental storytelling, your aesthetics, your art and sound direction, your lore, and your character behavior. All of those things might be touched by the backstory of how your world came to be. All right, culture and order. This is not relevant for everybody's game, but it will be quite relevant for some people, and so you might want to include this in your GDD. So what are the cultures, social systems, hierarchies, and laws like in your world? This will strongly influence how characters treat your player and each other, as well as providing potential consequences. So there might be social consequences or judicial consequences for the player if they like step out of line or do something wrong. This is the part that requires the most real-world research and will make your world feel real and lived in. And it's also a place where your own cultural biases can really creep in, which is why experiencing other people's work and working with a diverse team can help a lot in developing a culture and order for your story. All right, a map or layout. I do want this for every GDD, some kind of map or layout of at least your initial like game area. So create a sketch or an outline of the world. Include key points of interest, like where your plot points take place, or where, you know, like important things in the game take place, or important landmarks. This should also incorporate the scope and the shape that you decided on earlier. And if your game is one that doesn't contain plot points per se, like you can still, for example, if you're making like a MOBA or something like that, you could still include maps that are like the maps that you would play as a player, you know, capture the flag style or whatever. You can include like a layout of that with all the major obstacles and places to hide and, you know, features. If you're making like a strategy or simulation game, you can include an example map, or you can at least include the kinds of things that would be in the example map, right? It doesn't have to be exact, but you could make that like critical path. Like, oh, I think it's going to be, you know, on a hex grid, I think it's going to be 20 by 50 hexes, and a nation would regularly be like 5 by 10 hexes or something like that. And there's in a normal game on a standard setting, you might have like 4 nations playing in this space. That would still be an example of what you could give me. And then finally, objects and items. So if applicable to your game, you could design or designate items like findable books, letters, weapons, artifacts that tell the player about the world and note where they are found. So if you're planning on having some codexes or some audio logs or something like that, just tell me a little bit about a few of them. That'll be interesting to have in your GDD as well.